This week in the Regency, our jumping off point is an advertisement for a house to be sold by auction, a house which is advertised as Sussex sea bathing, which is interesting in itself and something I might follow up later. But this is from the Sussex Advertiser on the 18th of September 1815. And it's Lot 1, a substantial modern-built brick and sashed house with semi-bay windows in front on the ground floor, a well-proportioned eating room, kitchen, scullery, larder, and other domestic offices, with a yard and carriage house. And that's what's got me interested in this particular advertisement. You can see that it also has, like, bedrooms and stuff, but the carriage house puts this particular house in a particular social bracket. And the reason I went looking for ads of what kind of houses had carriage houses is because of this guy. His name's Nathan. So I was on holidays, as you know, and this is in the beautiful southeastern part of Australia, and in a town called Ballarat, which was a gold mining town in the 1800s. There's a place called Sovereign Hill, which is a recreation of the gold mining town. And it's lots of fun, and they have many carriages there. If you ever get a chance to see it, by all means go. And they make all their own. They make their carriages, they make their wheels. This guy's a wheelwright and carriage maker. And I thought, this is my chance to get an answer to something that has been puzzling me since I did this last month's carriage video about the Sociable. So if you remember, the Sociable looks a bit like this. And the interesting thing about the Sociable was that in William Felton's treatise on carriages, he talks about saving taxes by being able to swap out the sociable body and the coach body. And that was all fine. And I went and did some research on that, and I couldn't find out how they did that. So I thought, this guy, Nathan, will know. So I asked him. And he said, basically, they have a pulley system in the rafters of the carriage house, and they just hoist one up and then move the undercarriage, the frame, along and drop the other one on top of it. And so if you see the building he's in, this is Australian hardwood, and this is kind of Victorian technology in terms of the rafters. But when you go to England, it would be made out of oak, pinned oak. And the way they work the oak is they work it while it's green. So typically nowadays when we're working with timber, we work with seasoned timber when we're building houses. But when you work with oak, you don't. You work with green oak because it's softer, and seasoned oak is almost impossible to work with. And so this is an example of a new set of oak beams having been made. And this is what it would look like a few hundred years later. This is an example of a barn, which might also have been used for carriages, which has been renovated into a home. And although those rafters look cracked and so on, in fact, they're incredibly strong because it's oak. And so the pulley system would have been set up on these rafters, and the carriages would have been lowered as needed. Some of them with their frames intact, some of them just the bodies going up. And this is how not just you could save money on tax, but it's also storage space, So that got me interested in the carriage house, and that's what we're going to have a look at today. Now, you might remember in the Sociable one that they were taxing people who had 8 or more carriages a huge amount of money. And obviously this idea of swapping over carriages and having carriages in storage in the rafters until the family needed them, that implies quite a lot of money. And so I started looking, first of all, at the big stately homes of England. And is there anything more big and stately than Castle Howard? I don't think so. And when you see this, it looks fantastic. And then off to the left, you see that there's the bit with the two little turrets that don't, it doesn't match this kind of very symmetrical middle bit. And the reason it doesn't match is because that's the stables. So looking more closely, this is how we enter the stables. And when we say the stables here, it's the stables and carriage block. And you can see it's a very high entrance to allow carriages to go through, but not that wide. And you'd have trouble getting some modern trucks through there. And the reason is that carriages, generally speaking, were not very wide. The roads were narrow. Even, being able to pass two carriages on a road was quite tricky, and often led to accidents, particularly in curricles. So carriages, generally speaking, weren't that wide, and that width of gate was more than sufficient for even the largest of carriages. Just going through a few other, this is a place in Wales, this is in Norfolk, and you can see that they all have these double stories, and even the less high class nobility places like this almost condemned barn in Yorkshire has quite a lot of height, which is, of course, what makes them so attractive to people who want to renovate them. And so there may also be a hayloft in these buildings for feeding horses. But these are the kinds of buildings in which this idea of, okay, the carriages come in, but the family's not going to want it for the 3 months they're here in summer. Let's get it out of the road. We hoist it up into the rafters and bring down the open carriages like the landau. So the travelling carriage goes up, the landau comes down, and the family has something to travel around the district with, where they can see the sights and be seen. What about if you were not that rich, though? These are mews carriages. This is a carriage house from the 1818. You can see there that you've got one little window at the top. Generally speaking, grooms lived over the stables. Now, this stable, this carriage house, may have had both carriage and horses. And only part of the upper story then would have been turned into a place for the grooms to sleep. But generally speaking, this would have been a place that had both carriage and horses kept in it, rather than two separate places like you have with Castle Howard, where the stables are on one side of the block and the carriages are kept elsewhere. This again is a coach house from the Regency. You can tell particularly by the way the tails on the horses are kept. And clearly it's got the big door into which goes the carriage, and the smaller doors into which go the horses for their own separate loose boxes. And just as an aside, the reason that horses' tails are clubbed is so that they don't get caught up in the traces, because that would be very painful for the horse. So it's a safety measure. That's why the horses are like that. And so here you have someone who has more than one horse. He has a riding horse and a carriage horse. That's a gig. We know because it's only one horse and two wheels. And so he has everything in the one building in a barn. You might call it a carriage house, you might call it a stables, you might call it a barn. It just depends where you were in the country as to what you called it. In London, you have mews. And so here what's happening is the people from the country will come to the city And or if you lived in the city, this is the kind of carriage house that you would have, and you would keep your horses and your carriage in the same area, and your grooms would sleep above it. Now you can see that those doors on the top, they're very modern. If you look further down the row, you'll see the Georgian windows on the white house with the little lantern on it. And that's much more likely the way it would have looked during this period. So carriage houses came in all shapes and sizes. Some of them, the horses were in with the carriages. Some of them were in a different place. Sometimes extra carriages that we're not using right at the moment get hoisted up. And I guess that's also, if you had a lot of guests, that was a way of making room for your guest carriages to be stored while they were staying with you. And this size of the carriage house was very carefully calculated for the kind of carriage that you would have. Somebody who has a gig only and a riding horse, like our man here, would have a smaller area than somebody who had 8 carriages, yeah, obviously. I suspect this barn also kept cattle in winter, milking cows, and possibly also stored hay. So for people who were not super rich, barns or carriage houses, coach houses, often had multiple uses. I was absolutely fascinated by this idea of hoisting a carriage up. And I have to tell you a little anecdote. I used to work for the Powerhouse Museum, and when it was being built, one of the exhibits was a Catalina flying boat, a plane. And the day it was due to be hoisted up into the rafters so that people could see it from a number of different angles, the crane drivers went on strike. And so we had this enormous plane, a very tight schedule, and no way to get it up. I was making film about it for the Powerhouse. And so I was there when they decided that they would winch it up by hand. They had the pulley set up. They had like miles of chain. And these 3 guys over 6 hours hoisted just themselves, pulling the chain in relays because it was so exhausting. These 3 guys hoisted an entire plane, like, I don't know, 60 foot into the air. It was an extraordinary thing to watch. And it shows that if you have manpower and a pulley, you can do just about anything in terms of moving objects. It's a really vivid memory for me because it illuminated so much of the past in terms of how did they do that? Well, they did it this way. They did it with pulleys and they did it with people. And so they did with carriages, apparently, in the Regency. So that's this week in the Regency. Now, next week in the Regency, there will be a special extra fashion video looking at contemporary fabrics. I had the chance to actually see and touch some contemporary fabrics from the Regency, and I'm going to share that with you next week. I'm Elizabeth Layton, and I hope to see you there next week in the Regency.